Hello, everyone. This is going to be 21.2. This is obviously part two of chapter 21. We're going to start with a primary source. This primary source is from the Great Depression. It is entitled Migrant Mother. It was photographed by a photographer working for the U.S. government during the Great Depression named Dorothea Lange. She took this photo in 1936. It was staged. She did ask the two kids to turn their heads and, kind of place the mother in the right place, but it was seen sort of as a sign of both the hardship and American resilience during the Great Depression. And it shows a woman, a mother named Florence Owens Thompson, and three of her children on a farm in California during this time. She had been born in Oklahoma, but moved west to California looking for work during this time. And this became a famous picture of sort of, again, the hard times that people were going through mixed with the resiliency of the American spirit. So here is the photographer Dorothea Lange, 1895 to 1965. She was a photographer from New Jersey. She documented the Great Depression, and in the 1940s during World War II, she also took photos of Japanese American internment during World War II. And ended up teaching photography at the San Francisco Art Institute. So she once said that a camera teaches you how to see without a camera. And so I guess this is a double primary source. Now, the New Deal had come about to help the people, although it was not exactly clear on who the people are. However, the New Deal was relying on a lot of votes of senators and congressmen, and it relied on a president with their own feelings, their own personal biases, and things like that. And that had an impact on who it decided the people were. This led to the New Deal not exactly doling out money and hope and opportunity equally across the board. First, let's look at the New Deal and American women. Now, first of all, to specific women, the New Deal was very helpful. It did bring new jobs and new opportunities. There were several women who got new jobs and opportunities during this time, one being Frances Perkins. She became the first female cabinet secretary under FDR. She was the Secretary of Labor. We actually met her back during the progressive era of the 19 teens. One of the most prominent women of this time was Eleanor Roosevelt, FDR's wife. She sort of redefined the job of First Lady. Before, the job of the First Lady had been to sort of be in the background and, cook the meals and stay out of the way. Eleanor, however, was advocating for causes she believed in. She spoke loudly, she spoke often, she publicly disagreed with her husband, and she often was sort of not just his voice, but also his, I don't mean this crassly, but his legs. She traveled for him. She traveled around the world. She met with people that he could not meet because of his disability at the time. And that included going up in an airplane that was being flown by a black man at the Tuskegee Institute. She did a lot of things that FDR wouldn't or couldn't. So here is Eleanor Roosevelt, 1884 to 1962, from New York. She was a first lady. She was an activist. She was the first American delegate to the United Nations as well. And her father was Teddy Roosevelt's brother. She was Teddy's niece. And like we've said earlier, Franklin Roosevelt's fifth cousin, I believe, is that what makes her. She also would give weekly press conferences to female reporters, something that her the lady who followed her, Bess Truman, would not do. Now, most women saw their economic and political power go down during the Depression. Women were expected to get out of the way, leave the workforce, open up those jobs for men. Many married women were actually banned by the U.S. government from having jobs if their husbands were already working by state and by federal law. Some New Deal programs actually specifically barred women. Groups like the CCC Women were not allowed to participate, and even if they were, many were not chosen to participate in these job programs. Now, that is women. Let's also look at how African Americans were treated by the Great Depression and by the New Deal. Democrats have been working for years to stop blacks in the South from voting. Remember, it was Democrats who were behind, the redeemers of Reconstruction. It was the Democrats who were trying to suppress and subjugate African Americans in the South. And they also were incredibly powerful when it came to the New Deal, because they were Southern Democrats, and FDR, a Northern Democrat, needed their votes to get his New Deal stuff passed, and that gave them control over where the money went. Roosevelt felt that he could not speak up or fight back against a lot of things that the Southern lawmakers were doing, such as, especially, there was a big call for a federal law against lynching, but FDR would not support it because he was afraid of losing the vote of the Southern Democrats. And through their demands, the Social Security Act intentionally and initially left out domestic and agricultural workers, which is basically farmhands and maid servants. And these were the two biggest job sectors for black workers. So they had power over the New Deal, basically. So here are some people protesting some of this. So this is students from the HBCU Howard University standing with nooses around their necks to protest the lack of an anti-lynching law at the National Crime Conference in 1934 in D.C. Now, New Deal laws that could have benefited all Americans failed to pass the House and the Senate, including one that was supported by the NAACP and the Urban League that basically would have said everybody gets access to Social Security, not just white people. White Southern lawmakers were worried that if they gave rights and benefits and pensions and Social Security to African Americans, this could disrupt the segregated labor system in the South. Now, since black people were not eligible for Social Security and many other benefits during this time, they became dependent on basically government handouts, welfare. And this created a sort of a stereotype and a stigma around welfare, that it was sort of, a black problem in a way, that it was a program mainly for African Americans. And we saw this right up through the 80s and the 90s, where basically welfare was seen as sort of like, an African American issue and not a white issue. Now, we also see with Native Americans, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, a guy named John Collier, launched what was called the Indian New Deal as part of the larger New Deal. This program stopped forced assimilation. It gave tribes a lot more self-rule than they used to have. It also got rid of the Dawes Act, if you remember that from chapters and chapters ago, where it basically eliminated the tribal system of many Native American tribes. It allowed Native American tribes to live as tribes again, and it closed down a lot of the boarding schools, or at least changed the purpose to one of cultural preservation. However, the government still basically said that our laws are the most important. National government, U.S. laws, still hold precedence over autonomous Native American laws that might pass. They could overrule local Native American laws, and they still did. And also, in general, a lot of the funding just didn't find its way to the reservations, and life on these reservations remained rather bleak during this time. So here's John Collier and tribal leaders. The book said that they were believed to be of the Blackfoot tribe in 1934. We also see this with Mexican Americans. Mexican Americans had been welcomed to the United States during World War I. They were needed to work on the farms and in the fields and to grow the food that we were sending overseas. This was when labor was in high demand. However, now that jobs were more scarce, they were basically being forced back into Mexico. And some of them who were moving, quote unquote, back were actually born here in the United States. More than 400,000 Mexican Americans were being removed back to Mexico, many of them under pressure from the southwestern American lawmakers. This included citizens, children who were born in the U.S. and therefore were citizens of the United States, were being asked or even forced to move out. Now, attempts to advocate for Mexican American rights or to organize the workers were suppressed as well. There was also a movement during this time, since they were being suppressed and since their Mexican heritage was under threat of being erased, their culture being erased. There was a movement to sort of promote Mexican American pride and independence, later dubbed La Raza movement, Spanish for the race. Now, the U.S. government also tried to send back a lot of Filipino Americans to the Philippine Islands in Asia. However, if they were sent off to the Philippines, if they wanted to come back to the United States, they would basically have to re-immigrate. They would no longer be full-on citizens like they were. And so, of about 45,000 Filipinos, only about 2,000 actually agreed to this. Now, black Americans were one of the hardest groups hit by the Depression. Unemployment was double that of white citizens. Many families took very low paying, very demeaning jobs. Many others could not find jobs at all and were forced to depend upon welfare. Black leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois actually called for black owned businesses instead of depending on white handouts, and said that basically, don't buy where you can't work was one of his slogans. Either white people have to hire you, or let's have some black owned businesses and we will buy there instead. Now, while FDR was remaining quiet on many of these issues of civil rights, we've already mentioned that Eleanor Roosevelt was not staying quiet on these issues. She was quite loudly advocating for civil rights. And he did sort of hire many African Americans to be sort of his unofficial set of advisors on racial issues. They called this his Black Cabinet. One of the most prominent was a woman named Mary McLeod Bethune, who was an educator and an activist and became sort of his advisor on what he called minority affairs. And like we said, Eleanor Roosevelt also campaigned for more civil rights. She was seen, she was photographed with black Americans, including black pilots at the Tuskegee Institute. She resigned from the Daughters of the American Revolution, a very prominent group, when they refused to let a black opera singer named Marian Anderson perform at their function. Instead, she set her up for a concert at the Lincoln Memorial and sent it across the world on the radio, too. So here's Mary McLeod Bethune, 1875 to 1955. She was born in South Carolina, but moved across the South during her time. She was an educator and a philanthropist and a civil rights activist, and she helped found a college. Her story was she had to walk 5 days to and from school each morning as a child. If you ever heard the story of the grandpa saying, "I used to have to walk 5 miles a day to get to school," you don't know how good you have it. That is a legit story of Mary McLeod Bethune. She became the Director of African American Affairs at the National Youth Administration during FDR's time. She also served as a special assistant to the Secretary of War during World War II as well. Now, while not being directly impacted by the New Deal, black workers did actually change their voting habits. So we see this especially in the North and in the West. In the American South, a lot of black Americans still do not have the right to vote. A lot of Northern and Western African Americans changed their vote to Democrat during this time, feeling that, we're not getting all the benefits that we want, but he is at least head faking towards civil rights. However, like we said, FDR depended upon Southern Democratic lawmakers to get a lot of stuff passed. And so this meant that a lot of things that were desired by African Americans, including an anti-lynching law, did not pass during the New Deal time. Now, the Federal Housing Project also reflected the discrimination faced by blacks during the New Deal, being unable to buy the houses that you wanted. The Federal Housing Act, which was sort of the New Deal trying to help people get mortgages and insurance for buying houses, which was incredibly important during this time. This is sort of the beginning of governmental redlining, where basically they said, okay, if you want insurance, you're going to want to have to live in this white-only area up here. Black federal workers also during this time were mainly in menial jobs, or they were refused jobs, in the deeper South. The civil rights would not really enter the federal inclusion debate until the 1960s, until the civil rights movement, basically. Now, let's look at a new conception of America during this time, too. Many racial groups were still facing discrimination. Other groups were being welcomed in the New Deal. So Jews and Catholics were both hired in New Deal programs, and many actually helped to sort of create the New Deal. This actually got FDR some criticism. Anti-Semitic people who did not like the New Deal often refer to it as the Jew Deal because he hired Jewish people to help him come up with his economic plans. But however, Jews and Catholics and immigrants were mainly voting Democrat during this time. And in response to this, one of the first laws that FDR passed was the repeal of prohibition, which was not seen as a popular thing by Jewish people and Catholic people in America. He repealed it in 1933. We see that cultural pluralism, this idea of, you're part of America, you're part of the larger American culture, but you are still retaining your cultural and ethnic identity, became more accepted during this time. Many groups worked for labor reform and political activism as well during this time. So, one of these groups is the Communist Party, which never got hugely huge, but was much bigger, let's say, during the Great Depression. Because to a lot of socialists and communists, the Great Depression basically was, you see, this is exactly what we were saying, that capitalism is broken, that it's not functioning, it's not working like we thought it should. And so the party worked in labor organization. They protested for the rights of unemployed people. They worked for civil rights and civil liberties. And this time period in the 1930s, this effort was known as the Popular Front, where communists allied themselves with socialists and leftist New Deal Democrats, hoping that they would sort of gain a certain degree of respectability in America. And they did a bit. Here is, as the Time magazine sub Reddit down there says, Comrade Earl Browder, the Communist Party leader, on the cover of Time magazine. Now, according to Popular Front propaganda in the 1930s, real Americans were not the sort of fundamentalist capitalists of the 1920s. They were economic radicals. They were diverse. They were ethnically diverse. And a lot of the art and writing and movies of this time focused on the people of America, the whole tapestry, again, of America, not just one subsection of it. Roosevelt's New Deal projects often worked to preserve ethnic traditions, so they recorded folk music, for instance. They recorded the stories of formerly enslaved people who were now in their 70s, 80s, 90s. They recorded their stories before they died. We also see that Hollywood is championing the idea of the little guy, fighting against corruption, the normal American, not the higher up. One of the most famous examples of this, one of my favorites, is Jimmy Stewart as this nobody, this scoutmaster who is sent to the Senate and experiences corruption and fights against it in a Frank Capra film called Mr. Smith Goes to Washington in 1939. Now, labor unions and artists were also working, calling for more civil liberties and ethnic acceptance during the 1930s. They tried to promote things like racial justice, even deep in the South, in the segregated South. They were calling attention to what was called the Scottsboro case, where 9 young black men were accused of the rape of 2 white women, although there's very little evidence to prove it, if any. And they were found guilty 3 times by Southern courts. They were, however, eventually released. The Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, one of the biggest labor unions in the country, was also advocating for African Americans to join their labor union during this time, and they found them more than willing to join their labor unions. So here are the Scottsboro Boys from that time period. Now, while the Popular Front was gaining traction in some areas, especially the right to organize, not everybody was comfortable with this. In 1938, towards the end of the New Deal, we can sort of see it's falling off by this point. The House of Representatives created a group to investigate people and groups that they considered un-Americans. This was known infamously as the House Un-American Activities Committee. Of course, it's going to come back in a big way in the 1950s during the communist era, or the anti-communist era, the Second Red Scare. The groups they were investigating included communists, labor radicals, several other groups. They held hearings, and they could get you fired pretty easily if you were considered, if they found evidence that you were sort of what they considered to be un-American. Now, by the 1940s, holding communist sympathies in many ways, and definitely by the 1950s, could get you fired. Now, if viewed as a time for social reform, the New Deal had been winding down. Like we see by 1938, the House Un-American Activities Committee is already there, and we're seeing sort of the breakdown of the New Deal in the late 1930s. Southern Democrats are moving away from FDR's policies, especially after reports showed that the American South was behind in industrialization, education, healthcare. White leaders were worried that Popular Front groups would go into the South and instigate change, especially among African Americans in the South. And FDR even went in and tried to instigate change too. He attempted to get Southern white Democrat, sort of more less conservative Democrats to run for office during this time, in order to replace the ones who were backing away from him and blocking his policies. However, the Deep South said, no, we are not going to do that. The North also was having trouble with FDR at this time. Many Northerners were worried about federal labor like the CIO turning violent, or they were worried that the economy wasn't changing very quickly. And in fact, the economy was in many times getting worse during this time too. Conservatives also attacked New Deal programs like the Federal Theater Project, which basically was, which they said were sheltering communists and subversives and sort of getting people to be I'm sorry, lost my train of thought for a second. That making them more un-American, I guess, would be how they would present it. By the end of the 1930s, FDR had stopped focusing so hard on the New Deal and on civil rights or on sort of changing the fabric of America. By 1938, 1939, his attention is turning overseas, and he is looking more towards the rise of fascism and Nazism in Europe during this time. So here's an example of a theater program that was shut down during this time. It's a musical called The Cradle Will Rock that was a federally funded play with very heavy communist and socialist overtones. The cast is actually banned from the stage when they tried to perform it, and so instead they actually rented out a new theater and performed from the audience instead. Now, when we look back at the New Deal tried to do a lot. There's sometimes, looking back at the New Deal, some people thought it did a lot to change things. Other people said it didn't do quite as much as people give it credit for, that it was a bit more limited in scope. It did, however, expand the role of the federal government much further than it ever had been before. Now, whether or not that's a good thing is up to your perspective. Expanding the role of the federal government is beloved by some and despised by others. It also helped to redraw the political lines of America, and it helped to gain both supporters and detractors for its successes and for its failures as well. In the end, the New Deal was not what ended the Great Depression, though. What ended the Great Depression and what we'll look at next chapter is World War II.